I'm going to ask each of you who have not done so, to please sign the book just outside the door. If your email is on file, say that, but we want your name on the list so we know how many people attend these meetings. So please do that before you leave this evening if you have not already. I'm Ann Gordon-Curran, and I get the speakers for this meeting, and welcome. Tonight we have two speakers, so I'm going to introduce them both back to back, but they're speaking one at a time. That's the way we do it normally. One at a time. The echolele. Reverend Dr. Carol Jeunnette, Master of Divinity and PhD, was ordained in 1989 in the Lutheran Church after earning her Master's of Divinity at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. Her professional focus has been pastoral care and leadership of often troubled congregations. In this capacity, while serving as an after-pastor in a congregation where sexual abuse was a concern in a previous pastor, she met Rabbi Edwin Friedman. Through him, she was introduced to Bowen theory, which set her on a new course. She entered the postgraduate program at the Bowen Center, and over the years has been both a presenter and participant on many occasions. The Reverend Dr. Jeunnette holds master's degrees in family studies and counseling from the University of New Mexico and a PhD in religion and psychological studies from the joint PhD program at Iliff School of Theology and the University of Denver. In addition to congregational ministry, the Reverend Dr. Jeunnette has served as a pastoral counselor, hospital chaplain, and executive director of the Murray Bowen Archives Project. Her current foci include coaching congregations and clergy, presenting on Bowen theory in congregations, and expanding opportunities for clergy and faith leaders to connect to Bowen theory. For the past decade, she served as a chairperson of the Voyagers, a group of leaders of faith communities who gather twice a year to continue study of Bowen theory and Friedman use of theory and congregations in leadership positions. Founded 2 years after Rabbi Ed Friedman's death by a number of clergy who had studied with him, the Voyagers have been intentional about being connected to the source, Bowen theory, while simultaneously working with the rabbi's use of the theory. Over the years, the Voyagers have sponsored a number of conferences which are open to the public. She and her husband recently moved to Wisconsin, where they can be near one of their 2 sons and their 2 grandchildren. When she is not otherwise busy, the Reverend Dr. Jeunnette can be found playing musical instruments, currently a learner on the oboe. The second speaker that will follow in about 30 minutes is Dr. Ann McKnight, who has been the director of the Bowen Center since January the 1st, 2011. She has been a member of the Bowen Center faculty since 1992. Her activities have included directing, teaching, and supervising in the postgraduate training programs, leading the internship program, organizing and presenting at conferences sponsored by the Bowen Center, and at meetings nationally and internationally. As a family therapist for 40 years, she developed a special interest in families with addiction from working, teaching, and supervising students in a child and family substance abuse program in Virginia. Among other topics, she has presented on addiction and the family, the relationship world of young adults, death in the family, epigenetics, and ethics in family therapy. She is a family therapist in private practice in Arlington, Virginia, and at the Bowen Center. Ann is married and has 3 grandchildren, I think it's 3, and many grandchildren. She will be talking about Bowen theory. She will be taking the Bowen theory aspect of this discussion as her primary focus, and Carol Jeunnette will be taking the Ed Friedman aspect, but they will be integrated in many of the points that each plans to make, I believe.
We spent hours talking on this together.
Thank you, so welcome, Dr. Jeunnette.
Thank you, Ann. So thank you for inviting me, for letting me come here. Something that Anne did not say is that I have a bit of a reputation of being the fool who rushes in where angels fear to tread. I did it 10 years ago when the Voyagers and the Center for Family Process held a conference in honor of Rabbi Friedman around the 10th anniversary of his death. And I insisted that Mike Kirby be invited to speak. And I'm kind of doing it again. So we'll see where this goes. It was 22 years ago, yesterday. I was sitting in a darkened auditorium in Estes Park, Colorado at the YMCA of the Rockies. And I was sitting off to the side by myself. I was waiting for the speaker to come for the first session of our theological convocation for our synod in the Lutheran church there. The speaker was some rabbi who had written a book. And to be very honest, I had tried getting into that book 2 or 3 times and I couldn't make my way into it, and it had migrated to the bookshelf in the closet underneath the stairs, which means it was way, I had to think hard about where it was. I thought it was a little bit strange that they had invited this rabbi to come and speak to the Lutheran church, the Synod Assembly, but that was fine. There was a reason that I was sitting off to the side and alone. It was because I was avoiding people. I didn't want anybody to ask me how I was doing or how things were going in the congregation, because I knew if they asked me that, I was going to burst into tears. I was depressed, and I was ashamed, and I was hurting, and I was wondering if I had dragged my family through seminary, and then from Chicago down to Albuquerque, only to find out that I really wasn't called to be a pastor at all, and that I was a failure at it. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next in Albuquerque, because I figured the bishop wasn't going to put me in another congregation, so it was pretty bad. It had been a difficult couple of years. My parents had been with us in the Christmas of '93. Christmas morning, my stepfather, Harry, had gone into fibrillation. He had congestive heart failure. This was at our dining room table. There was brain damage from lack of oxygen. The family blew up over whether or not to just put him in a nursing home and let him die. And my brother didn't speak to me for at least a year. So about 6 weeks after this happened, we got my stepfather moved back to Kansas City, and the doctor found a melanoma on my back. A few months after that, our son did a mild suicide attempt and was diagnosed with ADD. 6 months later, the same son left home a year early to spend his senior year up in northern Michigan. And about 2 months after that, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. I did everything that I could in my power to keep up with my work at the congregation, and I thought things were going really pretty well, until the tension between me and the choir director got worse. And I did a couple things that I thought were relatively innocuous things, but I was wrong, and it blew up. And the organist went to the choir director organist went to the senior pastor and gave him an ultimatum. Either Pastor Carroll goes, or I go. He was trying to get out the door for a trip to Puerto Rico, and so he responded and said, okay, have your resignation on my desk when I return, which was not what she had been anticipating. That evening, she went to the choir rehearsal and cried about how awful Pastor Carroll was, how unloving Pastor Carroll was. Now, I forgot to mention something about this congregation. Several years before I was called there, it had been discovered that the pastor, who was well-loved, who'd been hanging out there for 25 years, had been sexually abusing women in the congregation for 20 of those years. And I use the word abuse intentionally. This was not just misconduct and affair, this was abuse. He had retired before the information came out, but when it did come out, it still just really messed up the congregation. It was deeply divided. There were people who said, this is a pack of lies, this man baptized and confirmed and married my children. And there were other people who thought, no, this is true. There were some who said, I know women. The women who accused him have problems. So it was a mess. The reality is that it was a place that, because of all of this, didn't know if they could trust pastors. And so when the organist went up to the choir and wept all over the place about her mistreatment at the hands of Pastor Carroll, it spread pretty quickly. So on Sunday mornings when I would walk through the narthex, it was excruciating because I didn't know what people were thinking about me. I didn't know who thought I was a wicked witch of the West or worse. And I didn't have a clue what I should do. At one moment I would want to shout out and say, wait a minute, will you look at me and look at what I've done here? I've done good work here. Do you think the best youth program in town says something? Do you really think I'm not loving? And the next instant I wanted to say, look at this lady, she's absolutely crazy. She's bonkers, she's got borderline personality disorder.
Could you speak up a little? People are having trouble hearing.
Okay.
Thank you.
I couldn't figure out what I had done that was that bad to cause all of this. And I was stuck. I thought my only option was going to be to leave. So I slouched in my seat in the auditorium in Estes Park, and I watched the rabbi walk across the stage, not expecting a whole lot. He was kind of strange looking, a tall man. He had one pant leg still stuck in his boot, and his comb over was kind of unfurling because he pulled off his stocking hat. And he started talking, New York accent and all, and the light bulb started going off in my head. Systems, emotional process, triangles, anxiety, reactivity, this thing called self-differentiation. He talked about Renaissance and Columbus and explorers and Federalist Papers and the immune system, evolution and self and family. He was all over the place. Talked about biology. I'm a musician and a theologian. Biology did not interest me at all, but it began to interest me at that point. And he actually did talk a little bit about God. There were 3 lectures on that day. Maybe each was an hour long. These are the notes I took in those, or it's up here, sorry. These are the notes I took, 17 pages of notes as he was talking. 22 years later, not only do I still have them, I could put my hands on them quite easily, and we don't want to talk about how many times I've moved in the meantime. That day, I knew that there was a different way to think about what was going on in my congregation. And I knew that I was going to learn as much as I possibly could about this systems stuff. So I know I'm not the only pastor with this story. There are thousands of similar ones. Let's see. Let me make this move. There. Try again. There's rumor that there even was a bumper sticker. Rabbi Jesus saved my soul, but Rabbi Friedman saved my ass. Oops, I lost a slide. Oh well. Friedman was considered or called by some the rabbi for all clergy. He was called the one who was the rabbi for the clergy who didn't know Jesus but knew his flock. Knew his flock. So, there we go there again. Who was Rabbi Edwin Friedman? He was born in New York, grew up in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. As his daughter puts it, he was the only child of a charming father and a quick-witted mother. His grandmother lived with him. His grandmother was an immigrant, and it's from his grandmother that he really got the religion, the Jewish religion culture. His parents were cultural Jews, not practicing. In high school, he loved basketball, not academics. His daughter wasn't sure how he ever made it into college. He did, though. He went to Bucknell University and studied basketball the first semester until he was about to flunk out and then decided to change his ways. He majored in history and literature. He would write for the newspaper, and he would have a new cause to write for every week. Very passionate person. Went to Hebrew Union College, the Doctor of Divinity College there. He was a rebellious student, challenging his professors all the time. At one point, he and a friend asked for permission to go and spend a year in Israel, and the assumption was that the reason they were given permission to do that was because they were troublemakers and they could get rid of them for a year. And he came back fluent in Hebrew and understanding Jewish culture. He was ordained in 1959 and then moved to DC here where he became rabbi for, I think, his Temple Shalom. It was a complex congregation. He was forced out after about 5 years, unable to navigate the politics and the anxiety. and he started into psychoanalysis at that time. Somewhere along the line, he decided he wanted to be a therapist, a lay analyst. He took a job in the Johnson administration and then was asked in '64 to start a new congregation. In '66, he began private practice of family psychotherapy and private supervision with Murray Bowen, which continued until '71. Attended seminars at Georgetown, probably seminars conducted by Dr. Bowen. His first presentation at the Georgetown University Symposium on Family Theory and Family Psychotherapy was in 1968. The title was Ethnic Identity as Extended Family in Jewish-Christian Marriage. It was a theme of his. 1968 was also the year that Dr. Bowen first appointed the first group of faculty for the Family Center. Now, remember I said that I invited Mike Kirk, wanted him to be invited to that conference. His presentation is where I got an awful lot of this information. So, according to Mike Kerr in presentation at that conference on the 10th anniversary of Ed's death, Dr. Bowen mentioned that he had seriously considered putting out on his faculty and spoke to the department chair, Dr. Steinbach, about it. Dr. Steinbach said that Ed was too controversial to be on the Georgetown faculty. 1970, Friedman presented one of his more famous papers, The Birthday Party, at the symposium. Presented many, many times during the next 10 years, really up until 1982. In '79, he left the congregation to focus full-time on writing and family therapy, and I think on the Georgetown Center. In the early 80s or late 80s, he had quadruple bypass surgery. 6 months later, Dr. Bowen had 2 major operations. In between those 2 events, in February 1981, and again, this is according to Mike Kerr, Dr. Bowen attached a memorandum to a faculty application that Ed Friedman had submitted. And this memorandum, dated February 27th, addressed to Richard Steinbach, said this. I'll read it for you. It's kind of hard to read, I would think. I want Rabbi Edwin Friedman appointed to the faculty because he brings a new thinking dimension to family theory and family therapy I have never heard in others. The different dimension is important in our teaching programs and the development of research projects. Now to some very personal and private comments. Rabbi Friedman has been loosely associated with my family programs for almost 15 years. He's grown in stature locally and nationally. He's much in demand as a teacher and speaker. All his positive qualities could be served in his present loose association with the Family Center, but he wants something more definite. I'll skip a sentence. I do not want to lose this genius-type expert I have helped to create. I want him here, and I will somehow manage any adverse professional reactions. This memo was written about a week before Dr. Bowen went into the hospital for the surgeries, and after that time, he had a long period of recovery. He returned to the center in the fall of '81, but he never did submit Rabbi Friedman's application for consideration. When Dr. Kerr read this at the conference almost 10 years ago, you could hear a pin drop. It was so shocking to everybody. No one had any idea about this, even Friedman's daughter. Friedman did his last presentations at the symposia in '81 and '82. And again, in this presentation in 2006, Dr. Kerr commented that based on the tone of some comments that Dr. Bowen made about Ed in the early '80s, he concluded that there was something different between them. Dr. Bowen never saw why, nor did Mike Kerr ask. His comment was, I was in the triangle at that point. The mid to late '80s, there's no record of Ed participating in anything at the Family Center until after Dr. Bowen died in 1990. His focus shifted to his own work. Generation to Generation was published in '85. Training programs began somewhere around '88. He had speaking engagements. There also were some shifts that Friedman talked about, shifts at the Family Center. That after Dr. Bowen came back, the focus and emphasis was more on science than on family therapy. At one point, the rabbi heard that Dr. Bowen was saying some negative things about him. And in '87, the rabbi wrote a 7-page single-spaced letter to Dr. Bowen indicating all the ways he disagreed with him and where he thought he was different from him. I'm going to get to that a little bit more. Late '80s, Friedman was working on a chapter on Bowen theory for the Brunner Maisel Handbook of Family Therapy, Volume 2, and was working on Friedman's Stables. Dr. Bowen died in October of 1990. Friedman continued to travel, give presentations. He was working on a failure of nerve, leadership in the age of the quick fix, at the time of his death in '96. It was this thinking that I heard in January of '96 at that conference in Colorado. So during his career, Rabbi Friedman was a highly respected clinician locally and nationally. He was a diplomate in the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, a clinical member, and then a supervisor in the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, and a charter member of American Family Therapy Association. So with that about Dr. Friedman, let me return to my story. When I heard Ed Friedman in '96, it was the beginning of rethinking and reorientation for my ministry and for my life. It was profound. As soon as I got the mailing about his seminar in the fall, I sent off my application and money. I read Generation to Generation. I tried to find out some more about this Bowen person, but I wasn't quite clear on who that was. I registered for a family systems course at the local university, only to discover that there are lots and lots of systems theories out there, and family therapy as a whole only got about a paragraph, much less Bowen or Friedman. When I went to the first seminar that I was registered for with Friedman in October of '96, I thought, wow, this is it. This is the direction I want to go in my life. I told Rabbi Friedman that I would like to get this thinking into seminaries. I asked him if he had any ideas on where I could do a PhD that would combine theology and systems thinking. And his response was, can't be done, and he turned off and walked up the stairs. The next day, he came back and he said, let me think about it, give me a call in a week or 10 days. He died a week later. So much for the call. And I did do the PhD. I sought out anything that I could find around Friedman. I went the next year to Center for Family Process. When I could get into Pete Steinke's Healthy Congregations and Bridge Builders programs, I did that. In '99, when Pete and another long-term student of Friedman's began a group for clergy, I joined it. It was then known as the Edwin Friedman Memorial Group, eventually was renamed the Voyagers, as a reminder of Ed's spirit of adventure. The first speaker was Victoria Harrison, and the group is often drawn on faculty from the Bowen Center. So I want to do just a little bit of a digression because the Voyagers are really important in this story. This group of clergy and leaders of faith communities has been meeting twice a year for almost 20 years now. We study Bowen theory, we study Friedman's application of it to leadership in congregations, we do family of origin, we do case studies, we try to bring in theology, and we've sponsored several programs and conferences over the years. The original Voyagers were all students of Ed's. The connection to his work is strong. But at the same time, there's always been a commitment to go back to the source to study Bowen theory, to be connected to the Bowen Center. And when I took over as the leader of the group in 2006, I made that commitment even stronger in myself. I was in the postgrad program at that point. It could be said that the Voyagers are in a bit of a triangle between Friedman and Bowen and the Voyagers. In 2000, I completed master's degrees and began a 10-year stint in working on a PhD. It felt like 10,000 years sometimes. Developing a pastoral theology of congregational care and leadership using Bowen theory plus Friedman and aspects of process theology. In 2003, I decided it was finally time for me to go to Mecca, which is here. Time for me to go to the Bowen Center. Took me a long time to get there. I didn't know if I was quite ready for it. And I started the first of what would be 5 years in the program.
5 more minutes.
Yeah, well, can I go over? Okay. We're gonna be in trouble. I've known there were differences between Friedman and Bowen. But naively, because I thought Friedman's work was Bowen theory, I assumed that most people thought that also. I learned quickly at the Bowen postgrad program that to bring up Friedman's name or to say something that Friedman had said was not a particularly good thing to do, because it would receive a response that was usually somewhat derisive and dismissive that would say, Friedman is not Bowen theory. I didn't know what that meant. Are the differences so great that Friedman's work is another theory? Is it an extension of Bowen theory? Is it a misinterpretation? Is it continuous or discontinuous? Is the dismissal because of facts? Does it have something to do with the tension between the rabbi and the psychiatrist and multi-generational emotional process, or all of the above? So if Friedman's work is not Bowen theory, then what is it that I latched onto, and what is it that other clergy have latched onto that has been so wonderfully helpful? Okay, I'm going to skip a whole lot. Let me see where I can get to. So, what do I think? I went back and reread Generation to Generation. Friedman's work in this came into the area of pastoral care and pastoral theology from a different tangent and was significant within that field. It had all been individual to that point. He brought in a systems perspective. He shifted around the concepts a little bit. His concepts were identified, no, I'll put them up here. But he used a lot of general systems thinking, general systems concepts and ideas. He used the word homeostasis, which you could argue is also biological. But he did basically use a lot of general systems thinking. So the Bowen concepts are there, but the underlying assumptions about natural systems, I don't see in there, not in that one. Next thing he wrote that was very significant was that chapter in the Handbook of Family Therapy. At the beginning of this chapter, Friedman made a distinction that he is not explaining Bowen theory. It would be like writing a history of protoplasm and other natural systems in 30 pages. Instead, he writes about theory. But he's very clear in this that Bowen theory is about life.
Sorry, could you move? Yeah.
Okay.
A little bit more. A little bit more. Thank you.
Okay. Bowen theory is so tied up with the most fundamental issue of life, but he's talking about Bowen theory about life. Again, he presents the theory in a slightly different manner. His definition of emotional system, I think, works. It does leave out a little bit. The next book, the one he was working on at the end of his life, Leadership or Failure of Nerve. This one is not a book about Bowen theory. This is a book about using Bowen theory to think about leadership. And it's a different goal, I think, a different purpose. He used all sorts of different things, the things that I listed early in here. Talked about differentiation as leadership. I think it is Bowen theory. There are places where it's a little bit questionable, but part of the question is to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Do you identify where it might be going off? Do you have discussions about that? Or do you say this man has managed to express many of the concepts of Bowen theory in a way that people can hear in a way that's extremely useful? Friedman and Bowen had very different views of science. And I think that's one of the things that underlies the differences between them. Bowen was a positivist, a logical positivist. Science, what you see the facts, and that's the way it is, and that's life, and that's it. Friedman was more of a postmodern thinker that said that what you see is going to be deeply affected by the context around it, which means that Friedman would never have been able to give the gravity to Bowen theory that Dr. Bowen was trying to do. It's a different way of thinking about science. Another thing that's a difference is that Friedman is an application person. He was about applying it. He was about using it in his life. There was a tension between the two of them. I'm missing all these slides, but Dr. Bowen described Friedman as the metaphor man. He also described him as a popcorn popper who would take ideas and they'd just pop into all sorts of fun stuff. Popcorn popper. This is from Ed's letter to Dr. Bowen, the 7-page one. He said, "Do I water theory down? Probably. I've never considered myself your disciple, only your student. And is what I'm doing with Bowen theory a contribution to its erosion, or as time may tell, its evolution?"
It's
22 years ago, I sat
30 minutes.
in this auditorium trying to figure out what was going on, and I heard Dr. Friedman. And it made sense, and it gave me a way of looking at my situation, looking at life. It was jarring to come to the Bowen Center and find out that maybe this wasn't Bowen theory. And I don't think that's right. I mean, I think that there is an awful lot of Bowen theory in Ed Friedman's work. There are places, like I said, where he goes off. But it seems to me that it would be more effective to work at having conversations around where he might be different, might have gone off, rather than to basically dismiss him. I think that he made some very valuable contributions, and I'm grateful to be able to come here and say that. As a fool who rushed in.
Thank you very much.
So do project. And then,
Project.
yeah, also can you be.
Good evening. Have I projected?
Is this okay?
Yeah, it's great. Well, good evening. I represent the Bowen Center. And what the Bowen Center, I believe, stands for is the dissemination of Bowen theory. You know, so I'm going to represent Bowen theory tonight and how I understand, let me just get my slides, the differences that Bowen theory and what was communicated in Ed Friedman's writing, what the difference is between those two. Do I have the, where'd I put it? Right there. You know, I don't actually disagree with a whole lot that this is. So this is the question that I wanted to take up. In what way does Friedman reflect Bowen theory, and in what way does he express his own ideas? And what is the difference? What difference does that make? That's what I want to talk about tonight. I, only knew Ed Friedman tangentially. I was trying to be a supervisor as an AMFT supervisor for AMFT trainees. And so no one at the Bowen Center had that credential, and I went and consulted with Ed Friedman. And I think for about a year in the 80s, I was in his program. So I was able to observe kind of concretely what I thought at the time was Friedman and what was Bowen. That's my experience with the individual personalities. So I'm not going to talk so much about their relationship. I'm just going to talk about the ideas and what I think is the difference and the similarity. And I don't think either one of them is right or wrong. I think they are different. And I come out on the side of, over time, of being a representative of what I consider to be Bowen theory. My best effort at representing Bowen theory. Okay, and so one of the important things that I wanted to communicate tonight is I think each of them had something to bring to the table. Ed was this incredibly charismatic person who could communicate to the clergy. And I mean, in my denomination, they all consider themselves to be Bowen people. And I know that that came to them through Ed Friedman, that is their understanding of Bowen theory. But I think from the point of view of us who are trying to teach the theory or to communicate what Bowen theory is, I think it's important to be clear about what the differences are and to not conflate them. So Carol mentioned this. I mean, Bowen very much grounded his theory in natural systems. He was trying to create a science of human behavior, and he looked at the natural world as having the foundation for understanding the human family. And that was extremely important at the time by the time I got to the Bowen Center and was being trained there, which was the late 70s and early 80s. So in creating the 8 concepts, they emerged from the description of the emotional process in the human family based in the evolutionary history that was common to all human families that emerged out of the natural world. So, I mean, for instance, you know, Franz de Waal wrote Chimpanzee Politics. He described triangles. You know, triangles are evident in the mammal world, just like they are in the human family. We're going to China this spring. And, you know, what do Western families have in common with Asian families? It's the triangle. You know, that's one of the things they have, among many other parts of what I think Bowen theory describes. Okay, so natural systems theory is the capacity of the system to adapt. Differentiation is based on variation, and anxiety fuels reactivity and the inability to self-regulate. Okay, that is natural systems theory. The family is an emotional unit. It is considered to include all those members who are involved in the family interdependence. I think I'm probably just preaching to the crowd here, but I think it's important that I articulate what it is that Bowen described. Now, this is important to me because I think this is a difference between Bowen and Friedman. A symptom in an individual is the inability of a family or a congregation to adapt to the challenges they face. It is not an individual pathology or an evil or a virus. That is not Bowen's idea of a system. It is the anxiety of the system emerges in an individual or a group of individuals, a subsection of the group. That is child focus. That is his idea about child focus. So as anxiety rises, the symptom will emerge. In my personal congregation right now, the minister has just been removed by our national organization. And you say, well, what in the world is happening in this congregation that has allowed this to emerge in this way? So I think we're gonna see. Now, Friedman, you know, this comes from failure of nerve. And what I did in preparing this is to try to read. I didn't read the family therapy book that you mentioned, but I read Failure of Nerve, and I reread Generation to Generation. Friedman is very clear that his thinking is based upon field theory. Now, what is field theory? Field theory is a field is an environment of force that upon achieving homeostasis, that's where homeostasis fits in, functions to maintain that balance through inner adjusting. He writes that in Failure of Nerve. So what is field theory? It's any theory in physics consisting of a detailed mathematical description of the assumed physical properties of a region under some influence, such as gravitation. Now, I'm not sure I understand exactly what that means, but it is not, these are different ideas. They're not wrong or right. It's just they're different. So this is a physical. This is a theory based in physics. And I think the reason I'm bringing that up is because I think there is an outcome of that thinking. So Ludwig von Bertalanffy created general systems theory. And I don't actually want to read this, but what he's talking about is field theory, the relation of forces. Okay, there exist models, principles, and laws that apply to generalized systems or their subclasses, irrespective of their particular kind. So von Bertalanffy is trying to integrate systems from every area of study into one theory and the relationship of forces between them. It seems legitimate to ask for a theory, not of systems of a more or less special kind, but of a universal principle applying to systems in general. And that is general systems theory, upon which Friedman based his ideas. Now, one of the things that Friedman talks about in Failure of Nerve is the virus. And you think, well, a virus is part of a natural system. But the way he talks about a virus is different than how Bowen talked about a system as adapting to the challenges. What he talks about is this is an invasion that depends on the host cell to survive and takes over. That it's a malevolent force that comes into the system and destroys it. So he says some people behave like viruses or pathogens. So the task of the leader is to better regulate her or his reactivity when faced with heightened anxiety due to irresponsible behavior. Now, this is where, in my opinion, the non-anxious presence comes from. And that's sort of an emblem of Friedman thinking, the non-anxious presence. So when the pathogen enters, it's important that the leader be non-anxious. And when the leader can work on managing reactivity and stay connected to the relationship system, he can ward off the invasion of virus-type behavior. Now, I think it's very, Friedman talks a fair amount about World War II and the failure to stand up to the evil of Hitler. And I'm just guessing, I've never talked with him personally about this, but this, that the Holocaust and what happened to European Jewry was incredibly influential in the way he thought about the nature of evil. That's my interpretation, so I could be taken up on that. So he says concretely, the cancerous attack, now this is the virus, on Jews and others, was an example of not warding off evil. When bad behavior, the virus, is not challenged in congregations, the congregations become unhealthy. So this is this idea of a pathogen coming in and creating evil in the congregation, and the leader being important to warding off that pathogen. So these two theories have two different foundations and lead to two different outcomes in approaching emotional process in a relationship system. So Bowen was talking about what makes the difference in managing self in a family or a congregation or an organization. And there are two main variables. One is the level of differentiation of the individual, the leader of that congregation. and the level of anxiety. And he goes on to say, you know, that a poorly differentiated person can look fine in a non-anxious system, but when anxiety goes up, then people become reactive. So, you know, anxiety is in all of us. You know, there is a range. Let me see what I do here. There is a range of capacity in each of our families, in each of us personally, in how we're able to manage anxiety, the way we're able to represent differentiation of self. What Bowen talks about is, I mean, the first thing that I think is important in this is the capacity to see the system in one's part in it. That is, I think, a dividing line between Friedman and Bowen. Bowen does not say somebody is coming from the outside and do not have a failure of nerve to stand up to it. Bowen says you're part of it. You are part of the system. And if the anxiety goes up in that system, you are playing a part in it. And what part are you playing? And how can you think about it? And those are two different approaches to how to manage self in a system. I mean, he talks about emotional flexibility and objectivity, about the relationship system, which I think, you know, I think Friedman has taken up important ideas of Bowen's and has communicated them probably much better than Bowen ever did. But this is my perception of Bowen, the separation of emotional and intellectual systems, a set of principles to live by which one will conduct oneself in the system in which one is operating, whether it's as a clergy person or in a family. And then the capacity to define self in face of social disapproval. And I think this idea of the capacity to define self in face of social disapproval, that idea of defining self is different than warding off evil or warding off a pathogen. You know, it is not you that is the problem. It is our system. How can I find a way to be clear, thoughtful? I mean, I could be anxious. You don't have to be not anxious. But how can I take a position that is important, that is a principal position in the system of which I am a part? You know, so he says that there's a variation in the level of differentiation, and that for some of us it's harder than for others. You know, that some of us have a harder time in doing that. But it's not about evil or not evil. It's about anxiety and the capacity to manage it. So let me go back to the symptom. So in Bowen theory, a symptom is the result of the level of anxiety in the system and the way that anxiety is handled in the system. So that is not about a judgment about what is good and what's evil. It's about observing the emotional process in the system and managing self in a principled way. And that, you know, projection in triangles are the way that anxiety plays out in a system and the way that someone becomes the problem. So this is what Friedman says. I mean, this is what I read in the book, is that defining a self is in relation to the problematic person in the system, with the analogy of the virus, is to overcome and expel the infection while remaining non-anxious. And I mean, that's in failure of nerve. I mean, I think that is his thinking as it developed. Now, the other word that Friedman uses is sabotage. So he's saying that when someone is trying to defeat this problem in the congregation, there will be efforts to sabotage. And Bowen never uses that word, to sabotage, because I think it's too conscious a word. I mean, it would be this idea that, I think Bowen articulated the idea that when anyone in a system tries to become a more defined self, there will be a pushback. But I don't, you know, and then if the person can say consistent and calm and principled and defined, that the system will settle down. But he never used that word sabotage, because I think it makes you the problem, not me. Not me as part of the problem, you are the problem. So I think that's a difference between the two. And that's all I'm trying to do tonight, is highlight how the differences. Okay, so I have 8 minutes. So how do these two conceptual frameworks lead to different ways of approaching a family or congregation? Because I think that's the point. You know, what makes the difference and how a person thinks about managing themselves with heightened anxiety in a relationship system that's important. So this is the Smith family. I just gave this as an example. Mr. Smith, who's 42, has an alcohol problem. The family is upset with him. The wife wants him to leave. Let me see where I go. And so, I mean, I used to work with families with addiction. So that the wife wants him to leave. You know, they make him leave and then think, well, the problem has been solved. When really it's been difficult for the family to see how they played a part in that problem. Did they cause the problem? No. But they are a part of the family system in which the problem exists. So the idea about this is this family was doing all right until their capacity to adapt. The stressors in the environment were too intense. The family could no longer adapt. The husband ended up with a problem. But he's not the pathogen. He's part of an anxious interactional system in which he is absorbing the anxiety. Usually someone's drinking too much, they're creating anxiety too. So he gets sober, I guess, in this particular situation. And then the family reacts to that in a negative way. Like you don't remember all the bad things you did. Mm-hmm. So if the husband can stay on course and remain sober and not react, the family will settle down at a better functional level. So that's just an example in a family. Okay, so I'm ahead of schedule here. So if Friedman looked at this family, the father could be viewed as the pathogen. The homeostasis of the family was disturbed by the father's sobriety. The family sought to sabotage his efforts. The father needs to take on and confront the sabotage. You know, that is a different way of thinking about this particular family's problems. So this is the role of the coach, you know, to manage self thoughtfully as a resource to an individual, family, or system, to stay out of the emotional field of the system, which I think is different. I actually think that is a different framework than Friedman, to be aware of the triangles and be a resource to responsible functioning for motivated individuals. Friedman took a more directive approach, and I think if you, so Bowen was outside of the emotional field of the family and took a more coaching attitude. Friedman took a more directive approach, giving assignments that would disturb the homeostasis of the family or the congregation. And I think that is, if you read his descriptions of some of his efforts with families, it's interesting because he does paradoxes, he sort of throws people off. It's a different approach. I think Bowen had this idea that the family or the congregation, along with the leader, could learn about what they brought to the system, about the anxiety, about the emotional patterns, and then they would take the responsibility for making a change in that part of the emotional process where they played a role. You know, it's a different approach. I mean, Bowen did not tell people. I mean, I think later in his life, early on, I think he did. You know, they all played around with what do you call those?
Rehearsals.
So this is just a summary, which I think I've already said, that Friedman has a more general systems theory or field theory. The self-differentiation is what he called it, was based on standing up to the problems of the congregation. And, you know, if the virus invaded the system, and the problematic ones tried to take over the congregation, the leader needs to have the nerve to take it on. And Bowen, I think, based his ideas on this idea, that the human is part of evolutionary history, and it has a reciprocity, emotional reciprocity in a relationship system. That is, the individual has a part to play in the system as a whole. And that symptoms flow from a lack of differentiation of self, not from evil, and from a level of anxiety in the system, which is projected on or absorbed by vulnerable members. And a problem indicates the inability of the system to adapt, not an invasion from the outside. The inability of the system to take on the stressors or challenges that the system faces. And that differentiation is about becoming a responsible member of a system by understanding one's part in the process and taking action on one's own emotional functioning. So I think that is a difference, that Bowen talks about self. I mean, it is all about self, about differentiation of self, about emotional functioning, about managing self, about seeing the patterns of which one is a part. And it's not about that problem person over there, although most of us would like to think that. So, but I wanted to say, I have like one more minute. You know, I think that Friedman took a version of Bowen's ideas to the congregations. And I think that version has been helpful. I mean, he was so well known and so respected. And these ideas are so different from the way I've experienced, especially clergy, to see what's happening in the congregation. I mean, it was a different way of thinking. I don't think that he brought Bowen theory to the congregation. I think he brought some concepts from Bowen theory that were very helpful. And I think my goal here in being in the Bowen Center is just to try to be clear with people about how I think what Bowen theory presents for them, and then have people make up their own minds about whatever they think is useful. But I do think that one of the things about Friedman, and by the time I got to Friedman, and sat in on his course, it was so different from what was being taught at the Bowen Center at that time. I mean, he talked all about the theater, he talked about fables and metaphors, and I mean, he was not particularly communicating at the time I took it, you know, a clear systems framework. I mean, he had, you know, he riffed kind of his ideas, but he was certainly an important presence. And I think that many people would not even be interested in Bowen theory if he hadn't been out there talking about it. Even if he wasn't necessarily communicating the theory, he talked about it. And so anyway, thank you for listening to my presentation.